Hello, you all. We would like to welcome to this Brazilian debate. We are going to be talking about Brazilian foreign policy today, and thank you all for coming. We are having one more edition. We had four Brazilian debates in July and August, two in each month, and we had already another one that took place in September. We are having this right now in October. And we are still one short that we are going to take on November the 26th. So it's very nice to have you all here. We hope you all enjoy it. We had experts talking about different issues about Brazil and all in interesting debates. If you missed any of them, you can just go to our website and check on the recordings. All of them are already available for you. And I would like you to know that today's debate is also going to be recorded, and you're gonna be able to see it afterwards if you miss a piece of it. We also would like to ask you to have your mics mute all the time. If you have questions that will be asked at the end of the debate, please write your questions through the chat. And we're gonna be looking at the chat and harvesting the questions so that we can ask the speakers at the end of the debate. So today we are bringing two experts for our International Relations Institute, and they are gonna be discussing Brazilian foreign policy today. So we would like to give the floor today first to Dr. Monica Harris.
Should I start?
Yes, please.
Welcome, all of you. I hope you enjoy this conversation. I will be first introducing the theme of current Brazilian foreign policy, and I will call your attention to 5 different features of current Brazilian foreign policy. These features are, of course, interrelated, but I think it helps us to look at them separately, at least for a moment. So let's start with the conservative authoritarian framework, which is very much the framework that is informing the current government's policies more generally, but in particularly regarding foreign policy, where the people that are leading the foreign policy, 2 of the ministers, the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Minister for Citizenship, are very much aligned with this conservative authoritarian framework. So having this in mind, we see that family, religion, and patriotism are the core values that are expressed and inform the policies in focus here. Regarding the foreign policy in particular, what we see is a foreign policy very much focused on the reproduction of the traditional Christian family, and very much on destroying institutions that promote reproductive rights, LGBT rights. So very much a process of deconstruction of human rights institutions that have been since the 1990s supported by every Brazilian government. So Brazil has been very much part of the conservative traditionalist alliance that has been formed, and that involves countries like Hungary, Poland, and the United States. I call your attention in particular to the role of the foreign minister, which in a sense is not surprising, although in it is a very unique situation for Brazil, because even during the dictatorship, the Foreign Office was a little bit distance from the harshest right-wing policies. And in this case, it's the opposite. And Minister for Human Rights, Family, and Women, Minister Damaris Alves, a pastor, and very much involved in this conservative framework, and in working in Geneva in particularly to put forward this agenda. Second element I would like to call your attention to is the discontinuity between this foreign policy and all previous foreign policies, but in particular foreign policies of the democratic period. The term used by this government is the adjective that they use to portray their own foreign policy. They call it an anti-globalist foreign policy. So it's a foreign policy that leaves aside the Brazilian tradition of supporting multilateralism, legalism, international cooperation. And this is interesting. It's related to the first feature I called your attention to, because it is also a vision of destruction of international institutions. And it is important to understand that the idea of destroying international institutions fits very well with the idea that any collective public institution is a menace to individual liberty, which, again, is very much within this conservative authoritarian framework. The search for autonomy, which has been very much part of Brazilian foreign policy, also is left aside. And disregard for human rights fits with also disregard for environmental norms. And more perhaps concretely, we should note that the total payments planned for the year of $4.260 billion for for international organizations, only 50.4 million was actually dispersed. So Brazil has been very consistent in its aim of leaving aside international institutions. The third element I would like to call your attention to is the automatic alignment with United States foreign policy. The proximity between Trump and the current Brazilian president is well known. They share a vision of international politics and more generally of society. And the Brazilian president and even his family have been very clearly supporting even now in the electoral process, something that usually Brazilian presidents did not have a position on. In this case, a clear position in support of President Trump. And in general, Brazil has aligned its policies with the American government's policies. President Trump has designed Brazil a non-NATO ally. This happened in 2019. There have been military agreements. An agreement has been reached on the use of Brazilian base in Alcântara Basin in the Northeast. And Brazil has been expecting support for its entry into the OECD from the US. This hasn't really brought any great advantage, though advantages in the defense field, we may say that more cooperation is really taking place. But there are expectations that in the commercial sphere a real agreement could be reached. The fourth element I want to call your attention to is the abandonment of South America as a core region for our foreign policy. the idea that South America and more generally the global South is crucial for Brazilian foreign policy, which was of course very relevant for the government, the Workers' Party government is abandoned. UNASUL was actually closed its doors, and cooperation in the region is not considered relevant. And these two last features, they actually meet at the point where the government has incorporated a discourse very much in line with President Trump's discourse on the enemies in the region, Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua, within a kind of a Cold War framework. And these are seen also by this government as the enemies. We can get into the issue of Venezuela if you want in the discussion. The fifth and last element I would like to call your attention to pertains to the position of the government regarding, I think, one of the most important issues for anyone's foreign policy at this point in history, which is the systemic dispute between the US and China. And the government has found a way to work on two different tiers. On one hand, the very anti-Chinese discourse, the whole Chinese virus discourse that Trump has used, has been used also in our country. The postponement of decisions on 5G, also to allowing the U.S. to have play a greater role in this market. So we see that on the other hand, Brazil, of course, has huge common interests with China. China is our largest trading partner. Has been our largest trading partner since 2009. Investments by China are huge. And what we see is that there is a more sort of pragmatic tier, very much led by the vice president, that allows for these relations to continue to function in an operational manner. Of course, what we see, again, trying to see how these different elements work together, is that Brazil has not been leading in any way the region, Latin America or South America, in order to allow us to have a common position, a common stance regarding the dispute between China and US in the region. So what we see is each Latin American country pursuing its own policies vis-a-vis this systemic situation, and a complete lack of coordination in the region regarding this very, very central issue for any foreign policy decision maker at present. So now we're waiting for the result of the elections, and of course this government is very much preparing itself for a second Trump term, and will find itself in a very difficult situation if the Democrats win the presidential elections. We already see the candidate Vice President Biden making very clear statements regarding the environmental situation in Brazil, the defense of democracy and human rights in the region. So if the Democrats are elected, we will see a more difficult situation for this government regarding bilateral relations, but also its isolation within the international system more generally. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Monica. It was nice hearing you for this first part So now we give the floor to Andrea Hoffman, who is also a professor at our International Relations Institute. Andrea, please.
Thank you. So good afternoon. It's really a pleasure to participate in the Brazilian debates. What I'll talk will be very complementary to Monica's talk because she focused on Brazilian foreign policy, let's say the official or the government's foreign policy. And I'll be talking about how Brazilian civil society, organized civil society, or transnational, or the civil society which has been transnationalized the last years, has been reacting to this foreign policy. So we know that, as Monica said, there was a complete change, discontinuity with a lot of lines of foreign policy, and civil society also felt this move, meaning that now lots of actors, and by actors I mean NGOs and even social movements who have been, especially in Latin America, also transnationalized in the last years, they are facing a different moment in terms of being able to get contact with those transnational partners they had. And so before, actually my talk, I want to bring 2 points. One is to talk a little bit about this context, which I will argue that it's not only in Brazil, as we are all discussing, and Monica also made reference that Brazil is not the only country which has now an authoritarian and conservative government. So I'll be talking a little bit about this new moment that transnational civil society is facing in many countries. And then I'll give some examples in Brazil about how some initiatives, some examples of resistance to Bolsonaro's foreign policy. So first, and this context, there is actually a literature about that, and I'll be using here this concept of shrinking space. I mean, there is also the reference to closing space, shrinking space, and the idea is that in these last years, in lots of countries, as we've been discussing, also the US, Hungary, Poland, but also Turkey, and even other countries more recently, India. I mean, we do have a moment where these threats to democracy have been very different in different countries. But one aspect, I think it's quite often in this context, in different national contexts, but also they are quite often the same. And this idea of shrinking space means that NGOs in particular, they might face a lot of pressure by governments to, for instance, that pressure comes in different aspects. It might come in terms of receiving funds from international partners through bilateral, sometimes cooperation, which very often came in the past through democracy promotion, for instance, instruments, human rights promotion instruments. And so in many countries, Egypt, for instance, already during the revolutions in the north of Africa, we know that also in Israel and Palestine. So in lots of countries, there has been a very clear, sometimes with legislation, very clear legislation by governments that prohibits NGOs to get installed in countries, because they are not an international, they have to register, let's say, in the soil or in the territory of countries. So sometimes they face these problems in terms of managing to register, but even if there are domestic NGOs, they sometimes face a problem in receiving funding from traditional donors. So you do have domestic laws, also in banning demonstrations. I think in Brazil it hasn't been that much, but the COVID moment also added some tragic element in that, because not only it's more difficult for those NGOs and activists and social movements to demonstrate because of the sanitary problem, but also some countries and some regions, they do have restrictions now to gatherings, not necessarily political, but any kind of social gathering. And that has been used by some of those governments, authoritarian governments, with a double effect. In Brazil, actually, we do not have that problem now, because as we know, Bolsonaro is in the group of the denials of the COVID pandemic, so at least a good thing. But in other countries, this has been used as an instrumentalized, let's say, to make more difficult those advocate movements to gather. And then we have also, for instance, criminalization of of human rights defenders, of environment defenders. That we have been one of the top, because criminalization, we have even recently with the burning the forest, the prohibition even of national authorities to go and have operations on the ground. We do have at the same time not denial but non-recognition of death threats and deaths of those activists, and Brazil has been also on the top record of environmental protesters killing the last year. There's a lot of data about that if you search. So there's a lot of traits that, again, they're not exclusive to Brazil. They have been happening for some years, again, in the north of Africa and Egypt and Turkey. This has been before that Bolsonaro came to power. But what we saw is that some countries, they start getting into there. And we can even say that these governments, such as Bolsonaro, they look at how these neighbors or these other countries did, and they might implement some same policies that are being spread all over. And Russia as well has been one of the countries who has using that. So I think one argument that I want to bring is that Brazilian civil society is facing that as well. It's facing this shrinking space. This concept, it's very controversial. Of course, social movements very often are differentiated from organized civil society. We can discuss that if you want the questions later. But again, the COVID pandemic kind of put everyone on board even more than one would expect, because all of those kinds of activism, organized or not, they are facing now alone because of the pandemic, also restrictions. So that said, what we see under this government, before the government, we had some years of increasing activity of these actors, these civil society NGOs and movements. And in the case of Brazil, we are talking, for instance, about indigenous groups as well. They have been, by the last governments, and this is not exclusive to the PT governments, but also before, they have been more and more included in these transnational activities, either because of themselves getting organized in transnational networks. The indigenous groups, for instance, have been very active also in the Americas, with the US and Canada, and in other groups more in Latin America or South America. A lot of these movements were during this last decade, where South America was pretty much one of the priorities of the government. There was a lot of transnational activities, and they were sometimes even using UNASUR, for instance, was one regional organization that opened up a lot of space for those actors to bring their ideas, to discuss, and sometimes to contribute to the implementation of policies in many areas. I work with the area of health, for instance, global health, and that has been one area where transnational actors have been able to reach out to this organization and bring ideas, bring policies, and implement actually lots of initiatives. So we did have that moment, let's say what we were in a line of deepening our democracy. Now we thought that it was a process of democratization, going deeper and deeper into the tissue of society. So it was not about the government being elected or not. The militaries were not in question. There was a discussion actually of inclusion also of militaries in many aspects. From a positive point of view. So this civil society was flourishing. I mean, so there are a lot of, comparing with 20 years ago, in Brazil today, there are a lot of NGOs, a lot of movements who managed to transnationalize, to get access, for instance, to this funding, and to be able to implement their views and their policies. And even if their local governments were not putting their positions, their demands, they were managed to reach out to in the region, to Latin American neighbors, or even again in the global level to the US, Canada, or Africa in the times of South-South cooperation. A lot of civil society cooperating with India and South Africa under the BRICS, even here Russia and China. So we came from that moment. And now under this government, we have civil society face a complete different attitude. Not only it's conservative and, as Monica said, authoritarian, but it goes direct against that. So it is a moment that's why I think this concept of shrinking society, shrinking space is very useful to understand, and also to put in perspective that it's not exclusive to in Brazil. So in that sense, we do invite some reflection about the structural causes, as Monica was saying, for the China factor. So it's not only here. So we have to look to the global level. We have to look to the international, let's say, relations spaces to see why in so many countries at the same time this is happening. Is it something to do with capitalism? Is it something to do with hegemony, transition from the US to China? What is this about? So certainly we have a lot of domestic particularities. In the case of Brazil, there's a lot of discussions about traditions and conservatism and long-standing exclusions and the inequalities, but also the fact that right now this is happening in Brazil, but also in so many countries, invites us to really look abroad as well, because to manage to get back on track, it's not enough to do only things at home. I mean, as Monica said, even the elections in the US, I think it's being followed not only in Brazil, but the whole world. It seems that to my American friends, and if there's some Americans here, I always say, your vote counts a lot. You are not voting for yourself alone, you are voting for a lot of people in the world. So vote well and don't miss that elections. So again, so I think we are facing that context now. The Brazilian civil society is being restricted in their activities because of this new foreign policy. And I just briefly, because I'm looking at the time, give these 3 examples that I wanted to bring to you to talk a bit more concretely about how civil society is trying to resist and how they are trying to engage transnationally to counteract Bolsonaro's foreign policy. Because of course, the Itamaraty and the diplomats, they are civil servants. We know that lots of them, they are very unhappy, they are depressed, they are perhaps wanting to be quiet in their corner, because but they are civil servants. As in all these other ministries, in the ICMB, IBAMA, all these environment agencies, they are all facing the same situation. They are all against this dismantlement, for instance, in the case of environment, because you don't do a concours to work in the environment ministry if you don't believe in environment. So this is in foreign policy, maybe you have ideological divergence, but in some areas like health or environment, people who to pass these concours, that they work in these ministries, I mean, it's not a question of ideology. They're all against destroying the thing. And that's what's happening. So again, that's why the civil society is so important at this point, because all those civil servants, they also face restrictions. We know that not only they are being replaced in the commandment positions by external people, by militaries, even in lots of examples, and they are. It's very easy to shut them up because they are civil servants. There are laws that actually make them have to obey their superiors, and we know that also there has been social control, media control. They have orders not to speak about the meetings they had. So again, even civil servants, they also face that, but that's in a way their job. They cannot go against that because there are very official rules about how in many aspects they have to respect the authorities, but civil society not. So again, that's why it's so important at this moment that those initiatives, they are heard and they hopefully now have some effect. So again, just briefly 3 examples who you might have seen in the news. One example from human rights, that already from August, we did have a Brazilian Paulo Abrão, who was one of the members in the Commission, American Commission of Human Rights, and he was re-elected to follow one more mandate. And suddenly, I mean, what was very rare, because I mean, this commission has some autonomy to point, and he was being continuing in the second mandate. There was an affair in which he was accused of administrative misconduct and so on and so on. And he ended up then not being able to renew his position. That was a very strong, that decision by the OAS, the Organization of American States, was supported by our government not to dismiss or to not allow Abrão to remain in his space. And then what we saw is that a huge movement on the civil society, lots of NGOs, human rights activists. So I have more than 138 organizations who not only actually they demonstrated, but they also they are trying they try to make pressure on the government, but also from other countries, not only the Brazilian government. But again, this has in this case, I mean, of course, there has been a politicization of the issue, but the government
Andrea, acho que você está com problema na
sovereign,
conexão.
he didn't appoint us.
Você pode repetir esse final,
Can you
porque
hear?
não ficou legal. Teve um problema na conexão.
Okay, sorry. So I'm just saying that in this case, that this effort by civil society has not been very successful, because obviously this is the commission is the OIS is an intergovernmental organization. So in the end, the countries have the say there. So another example that I want to bring from October, very recently, 14th of October, not even a month ago, there has been a mobilization in the WTO under the TRIPS agreement to suspend a patent for medicaments related to COVID used by governments, meaning from instruments to the vaccination that is being tested yet. And countries such as India and South Africa, they have been pushing that, and Brazil has a history of doing that with the HIV. For instance, Brazil was one of the main countries, was very active under the previous governments, and again, PT and PSDB, so it has been a cross-ideological issue, like a national issue from the global south against a powerful pharmaceutical industry from the south and from the north. So it has been a very broad consensus about fighting for public health, and also in that case, patents in those cases. And so there is a movement now in the WTO, and Brazil expressly positioned itself against that movement, although it does have one in terms of population, and the problem of COVID in Brazil is huge. And so immediately after Brazil announced that lack of support in the WTO, there has been more than 50 entities and 1,000 Brazilian specialists, and it includes people like from Fiocruz, of course, and has been a very active organization, and the ministry, but also, for instance, Leonardo Boffi and a lot of Celso Amorim, a lot of high-level politicians who have been signing those petitions and trying to create a transnational movement in favor of breaking that patent and against Brazilian Bolsonaro's foreign policy. So it's a second example about how Brazilian civil society has been putting itself against the official foreign policy. And a third one, very quickly, it's about climate change. And this is already from June, but that has been one of the main also areas where there's a lot of discontentment with the domestic society and the Brazilian foreign policy, and a very radical one in terms of reverting all the agreements, the Paris Agreement commitments, and with all the burning of the forests, and the Minister Ricardo Salles has been very strong in his positions. So we did have a mobilization also led by Observatório do Clima. A Brazilian network of 50 NGOs and social movements was created in 2002. And they have, together with Greenpeace and Instituto Socioambiental, they have joined, they have developed, put three lawsuit cases against Bolsonaro in the Brazilian domestic system. So here it was not only a mobilization in terms of calling attention to the topic, they are trying to criminalize Brazilian position on that, because with that position, they basically managed to have suspended fundings who were supporting these organizations, the Amazon funds, and that's underfunded completely a lot of NGOs. So if we go back to the idea of shrinking space, and that has been a key strategy by governments all over the world to cut international funding to domestic NGOs. And we see that today in Brazil in the case of and this huge mobilization has been trying to resist that. Again, all these three examples, to conclude, they have not been very successful empirically now in terms of reverting Brazilian policies, but I would argue that yes, they have been very successful in showing that there is more divergence in the society, that even if Bolsonaro was elected, and even in Brazil, we have to recognize that there's a huge majority and conservative, also culture in many aspects, structural problems. We do also see that part of that society is trying, and not only domestically through elections and other means to resist that, but also transnationally. So I think that was the main points I wanted to bring. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. It was very nice to hear your presentation. Monica, would you like to make any comments about what Andrea just said?
I would just like to stress a point that she actually made, but the fact that we have to, we're discussing here Brazilian foreign policy, of course, but we have to understand Brazilian foreign policy in the broader context of the rise of this, what I'm calling conservative authoritarian framework. And how do you, if you want to, how would you resist this? But to think of it in transnational terms, and it's not only a matter of diffusion. Diffusion also takes place, but it's also a matter of organization. So these different right-wing social movements are organized and are talking to each other and are helping each other. Steve Bannon has designated Eduardo Bolsonaro's son, as the representative for his movement, which is called the Movement, in Latin America. So there is an institutional connection that we have to look at also.
Okay, thank you, Monica. Andrea, would you like to make any comments on what Andrea first said?
Monica, yeah, no, I think you started talking about, Monica, the effect, the possible effect of the US elections, and I think that has been popping up because, I mean, what would be the prognosis here in terms of a change? Because on one hand, I think there will be a big relief. Now, of course, if Trump is not in power, there will be a structural, all over the world in those countries as well, like a window that will be open to change. But and then here, I think that perhaps is the problem, because again, the problem in Brazil is not only external, it is external also. It was a favorable international context to a conservative government, which also is the same context that was before already, in terms of disagreement and disalignment with the previous government. But at the same time, this is not all. So, I mean, so what do you think, Monica, will be the effects of a Biden government, in the sense that some, I mean, maybe the message is all this transnational civil society, but also the government. I mean, we'll be positive and full of expectations, but is it, I mean, it won't be gone like that, because if there is still a contestation between the US and China, if there is still actually in the end this conservative forces domestically, I mean, how to size the moment, but not to be too optimistic in the sense of relaxing and thinking that it will happen to by itself. I mean, there are real conservative forces in Brazil as well. So again, how to size the moment if Biden leaves and kind of transform this situation.
Should I answer, Ricardo?
Yes, go ahead. Yes, please.
I think the area where many possibilities will be opened if Biden and Harris are elected is the environment, because they have a very ambitious program, and apart from the program itself, you have within the Democratic Party, which is of course a very broad coalition, you have very strong progressive forces that will push for a completely different position on the environment. Moreover, from the point of view of climate change, there may be, you see possibilities of a cooperation with China, between the US and China, against the position that the Brazilian government has opted for. So I think that the Brazilian government will be in a very, very difficult position, more isolated, and it opens the possibility for, you know, to take the environment as an element, particularly amongst the youth, in order to put forward a strong criticism and resistance to this conservative agenda. I would say that the environment is a window of opportunity if Biden is elected.
Okay, thank you very much. So we're moving then to the questions from our audience. We had a couple of questions here. So Monica, the first is actually for you. Brazil's diplomacy is well known for its leading role in foreign affairs. So do you think the institution will hold?
Yeah, I think that's a crucial question. What we and it has two sides to it. I think, Angela. I think it has a side. I mean, will Brazilian soft power hold internationally? How much of the soft power are we losing? And of course, it's difficult to calculate. But I think the hurt is significant. Even if at some point we move back to a policy that supports multilateralism and the systems that, in a sense, the UN represents, Europe represents, regarding human rights, the environment, the protection of labor, and many others. So there is that question. I think Brazil can recuperate, but I think the hit is very, very strong. As if, there's a part of Brazilian society that was revealed in this context, revealed to the world, revealed to us, right? But also revealed to the world. And second, I think there is the other side of this question, which is the institution Itamaraty itself. And I think what most diplomats and important diplomats, leaders, they're sort of lying low. They're sort of, almost hiding in order to be able to come back at some point with a project, and the project is being actually drawn. There is an interesting coalition that has been built amongst Brazilian diplomats that involves diplomats that didn't even talk to each other before, like Celso Amorim and Celso Lapa, that see a common interest in moving back towards the sort of, let's say, common agenda of support for multilateralism, Brazilian autonomy, legalism, international cooperation, leadership in the region, all these elements that were abandoned. So I think that the institution Itamaraty will, yes, recuperate if in 22 we have a different government in place. If it's an 8-year government, then I think it's very difficult.
Okay, Monica, just take the chance that you are with the mic right now. There is a question that says, you said about the importance of China to Brazil, and I would like to know if there is any position from the Chinese government on Bolsonaro's government decisions. Do you think China could apply sanctions to Brazil in the future?
Is that for me?
Yes.
I don't see China applying sanctions to Brazil. I think China has huge interest in this country. I think this country is crucial for its food security, has been for many years, and they very much focus on this. So I think mostly the Chinese government has opted for pretending it's not listening to the absurd comments made by the Brazilian government regarding China. But I'm sure it's hurting, and I think that confidence and trust is hurting. And these are things that are difficult to measure, particularly in the short term. So I think perhaps this effect is not quite clear, and we'll have to see. But I don't see the Chinese government opting for sanctions.
Okay, thank you, Monica. Andrea, now turning to you. Angela also threw a question to you. Do you think that civil society in general will go back to the streets after the pandemics?
Yeah, good question. Because again, this was perhaps a bad coincidence, no? That of course the pandemics has that effect. And in Brazil or countries where the president is in denial, it doubles the effect, because people who go to the street and without masks, they are openly pro-government. And so if you are against the government and if you gather a huge demonstration, without social distancing, this has become a political issue as well. So it's a double kind of a corn. I mean, you cannot go to the street because you'll be then, of course, following Bolsonaro's idea that you should go to the street and be in denial. So I think this is a real tragedy in that sense. Very few countries had this double, this double issue. But I think here an interesting question is also that to what extent the virtual world, the online, the social media world has been providing an alternative in terms of demonstration. And here too, I think, as Monica said, there is also transnational networks and movements and whatever on the right, and they populated that space before. It all started, actually, we can argue, with this movement that got stronger online. And with all the fake news and the elections, the scandals, and then so I think they had a timing, like they had this innovation, like with the online social media, and they used that as with incredible how well they managed to use that and be effective and elect a U.S. president and elect a Brazilian president, big countries. I mean, and so. I think that maybe is one of the answers, like how these other movements because there is, I mean, we must admit that especially in the global South, I think this thing of technology, very often there is a kind of a prejudice against it. Like the social movement should be the one with the dirty feet on the ground and the river and in the nature. In the case of Brazil, in the Amazon, if the indigenous groups and populations on the territories, I mean, it doesn't fit this idea of, they sitting in a computer and organizing everything online. I mean, it destroys also a bit of this image of the ground of their native relation with their causes. And again, I think this is very difficult. We can see that some, and they hear the more kind of urban organized civil society NGOs, they do, and they are getting there. And I think they were not in the beginning because, again, I think it was like the right groups went first. But now I think we see a lot of mobilizations also by this other center, left, whatever, anything that is not this conservative authoritarian. They are using that space too, and I think this is good. But again, there is a big part of the population and the movements, and in the case of Brazil, if you think about the native indigenous groups, it's difficult. I mean, it's more difficult to not only to use those medias, but also, again, I think it's a tricky thing because they will be modernizing. They will be using, this technology, and this technology very often is seen as part of the problem. And so I think it's a very difficult moment, to how to catalyze all those. So I hope that the COVID, for all reasons, the COVID pandemic and the situation is somehow controlled next year. But I think that it was 1 year that created a huge asymmetry and distribution of power among those groups that are hopefully you will revert. But it happened. I mean, it caused a huge asymmetry as well.
Okay. Andrea, you also mentioned the effects of Bolsonaro's, of Trump's election or not election in the United States and Brazil. Would you give us a picture of how it would be if Trump is elected or how it would be if he's not elected? What do you think about it?
Yeah, I think I agree with Monica that in some areas, and I think the climate change area, maybe there'll be a huge change because, again, here he's the main outlier. All other countries or main big countries, and here we think Monica mentioned China, but then Europe, of course, and many countries all over the world, they have a different position on that. Now the denial of climate change are really outliers, but the human rights and other issues, I think it's still tricky because the OAS thing, for instance, with the Brown. That was Amagro, and that was in the OAS, and it's not necessarily controlled by the US government. I mean, so they are, that's why I said, I mean, we shouldn't be also too optimist, because I think there are standing issues in the among us in the Americas and that came before before Trump, and there were diversions, and even under Obama government. I mean, and so I think it will give some space to breathe because of this common threat to democracy, and it will be good definitely in the climate change. But also we cannot forget that there are some differences, and the last 20 years were reflecting that, the relations here between Brazil and other countries and foreign policy, that Brazil as a global South country, the whole issue of South-South cooperation was already a point of contention with the US. So even if now, I mean, these relations become more normalized and not this strict alignment with one government, we cannot forget that there are, I think Monica mentioned as well, China is there, and Brazil cannot afford simply not having relations with China. And also, I mean, what does it mean? I mean, maybe China has also good things. We cannot buy Trump's narrative that China is the bad boy and the child that brought the virus and is doing everything wrong. I mean, they are better in the climate change question, for instance, than the US or other countries. So I think, of course, democracy and human rights per se are not the record now of China. I mean, they have a huge also population. It's very complex. But again, I would not be too over optimist in terms of thinking that, okay, Trump is gone, everything is solved, let's you know, relax. It's not that easy, but it will be good, definitely.
Okay, thank you. Angela, just make a comment. Hopefully the mindset will be totally different with Biden, and Bolsonaro will be even more isolated. Or is it just a wishful thinking? Right? Okay. Andrea, do you have any final comments? Unfortunately, we're coming to an end. Our time is about to expire. So do you have any final comments you'd like to make before we finish this session?
No, I think it was very good. No, I want to thank you for the initiative, the Brazilian debates, and to the invitation. And I hope next time after the elections, if we have such a debate, we discuss other problems, but not Trump anymore. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Andrea. Monica, would you have any final words you would like to say to our audience before we finish?
I would also like to thank you for the opportunity of taking part in the Brazilian debates. I think this is a great initiative of our university and outreach to colleagues and students around the world. I think that we will come back to discussions on Brazilian foreign policy, Brazilian insertion in the world. And I do hope that it will be within the context of a more democratic society. Thank you so much.
Okay, just one last question that just popped out here. I don't know which one of you would like to answer to that. What is the role that the Igreja Universal is playing in the change of Brazilian foreign policy? Do you have any comments on that?
The Minister Damares that I mentioned earlier is a leader within the Pentecostal churches, and she has very much put forward their agenda, and it has had a very significant repercussion regarding the Brazilian position towards gender issues, LGBT issues, reproductive rights. Brazil has been pushing for all these rights to be scaled down.
So before we finish, I'll pass the word to our director, Dr. Angela Paiva, to say a few words.
Well, I want just to say thank you to Andrea and Monica for the wonderful conversation. I wish we could stay here longer because there are many things, many problems, right, to talk about. And it was really a nice conversation. And hopefully we'll have one maybe when when things are getting better, when our Minister of Environment will be dismissed, and when the Minister of Foreign Policy will be out, and then we can think about a better future, right? But anyway, thank you very much on behalf of CCCI. It was great to have you two here, okay?
Thank you.
Okay. So we would like to thank you all. We'd like first to thank, of course, Dr. Monica Hess and Dr. Andrea Hoffman for being with us in this afternoon. It was great to hear the two of you talking about such important issues in Brazil. And would like to thank you, our audience. We have a few colleagues here with us today. Dr. Jane Krasno is with us from New York. Also, Lisa Lancia from New York is also here with us. Thank you for participating in our Brazilian debates. We would like to thank our students who are here and so many colleagues and students from all over the globe. Thank you for participating with us today. And just for us to finish, I would like to share with you one more thing. Just give me a second. Okay. Yeah, I'm not able to access the slide I would like to share with you, sorry. So I'll just do it verbally. Next November on the 26th, we're gonna have one more Brazilian debate, and we would like to invite you all to be here with us once again. Dr. Angela Paiva and Dr. Rafael Gonçalves will be speaking to us. So please save the date and be with us on November the 26th. Okay, thank you very much and have a good day. It was great to have you all here with us.